The salt shaker in your kitchen is currently executing a prehistoric survival code that evolution forgot to cancel. 10,000 years ago, missing a single milligram of salt meant fatal muscle collapse and organ failure. Today, that exact same survival code is running around the clock in your kidneys, forcing over 1 billion people into chronic high blood pressure and premature death. Don't skip a single second and watch this video all the way to the end, because if you don't understand how your body handles salt, your biology will continue working against you. Your doctor tells you to cut back on salt. Nutrition labels treat it like a crime, but your brain screams for it like an addiction. Why? Because for millions of years, salt was as rare as gold, and without it, your heart literally stops. You aren't weak-willed. Your kitchen is simply filled with unlimited salt, while your body is built for a prehistoric wilderness. If you want to understand how this trap controls your life, hit that subscribe button right now before we dive deeper. For millions of years during the Paleolithic, your hunter-gatherer ancestors never once searched for a salt lick. They did not need to. A diet built around wild game delivers roughly 700 to 800 milligrams of sodium per day automatically, embedded in muscle tissue, organ meat, and blood. Wild carnivores like lions and wolves never visit mineral springs for this exact reason. When you eat the animal, you inherit the sodium the animal already accumulated. Simple, elegant, and requiring absolutely no infrastructure. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, salt was a problem that solved itself. Then, approximately 10,000 years ago, your ancestors made a decision that seemed practical at the time and turned out to be a metabolic catastrophe in slow motion. The agricultural revolution began across the Fertile Crescent, Asia, and Europe when human groups abandoned nomadic hunting to settle permanently and cultivate grains. Wheat, barley, rye, and rice are nutritionally generous in many respects. They contain virtually no sodium. When you shift from an animal-based diet to grain-dominated staples, your kidneys rapidly excrete sodium to balance the flood of potassium from plant foods. And within weeks, early farmers were experiencing the full clinical presentation of severe hyponatremia, agonizing muscle spasms, chronic nausea, cognitive collapse, eventually fatal cardiovascular failure. They had traded the lion for the lentil, and their bodies were losing the argument comprehensively. The agricultural revolution, for all its civilizational ambitions, very nearly electrocuted its own founding population in the opening decade. Nobody planned for this. History rarely plans for the obvious problem. Desperate and resourceful in equal measure, early farmers began following wild herbivores. Deer, bison, and cattle, facing the same dietary sodium shortfall from their plant-heavy diets, instinctively trekked for miles to reach natural brine springs and exposed salt licks. Early humans followed those animal trails through dense brush, watched the herds press their tongues against mineral-crusted rocks, made the entirely logical inference, and did the same. The results were immediate, overwhelming, and presumably rather astonishing to experience. Sprinkling ground mineral salt over bland boiled grain porridge not only resolved the electrolyte crisis within days, it also made food taste dramatically less terrible. An entire civilization's relationship with flavor changed because a Neolithic farmer followed a deer. Two problems solved simultaneously through observation of an animal's instincts with zero laboratory equipment. Salt was not going anywhere. If you've ever felt that late-night craving, drop a comment below and let us know what your go-to salty snack is. Your tongue is part of this story in a way that is difficult to appreciate until you understand the engineering involved. Buried inside your taste buds are specialized receptor proteins called epithelial sodium channels, or ENAC, first characterized at the molecular level by physiologist Bernard Rossier and colleagues at the University of Lausanne in 1994 and published in Nature. When even a single sodium ion makes contact with these receptors, they fire an electrical signal directly to your brain's gustatory cortex and reward centers, triggering a dopamine release registered as intense pleasure. In the prehistoric wilderness, this was a precision survival instrument. It drove you to locate scarce sodium deposits with something close to urgency. The same mechanism now makes it difficult to stop eating salted snacks because your targeting system has not received an update in 10,000 years. In the supermarket aisle is a very different landscape from a Paleolithic salt lick. The system is working perfectly. the environment has simply stopped cooperating with the original design brief. The demand for mineral salts scaled from survival necessity to full industrial obsession with impressive speed. Near the modern town of Providia in eastern Bulgaria, archaeologist Vasil Nikolov of the Bulgarian National Institute of Archaeology spent decades excavating a site that rewrote European prehistory. The settlement, called Solnitsata, dates to around 5500 BCE and is now widely recognized as the oldest fortified town in continental Europe, predating classical Greek civilization by well over 1,000 years. What drove prehistoric humans to invest in permanent urban infrastructure in the Balkans before the wheel was in common use? Salt. Solnitsata sat directly over massive underground salt springs. Prehistoric artisans developed a sophisticated extraction process, dipping ceramic vessels into the brine, heating them over domed clay kilns, and collecting the solid sodium chloride bricks left behind as the water evaporated. Each cycle produced enormous quantities of a commodity as precious as any metal. To protect this operation, they raised stone fortress walls up to 3 meters thick. Wealthy salt merchants buried at Solnitsata were interred with copper axes, fine ceramics, and gold ornaments, the world's first recorded economic upper class, built entirely on mineral electrolytes. If anyone suggests that wealth inequality is a modern invention, refer them to Bulgaria, 5,500 years ago. In our previous video, you saw how sugar secretly hijacked human evolution to build the modern obesity epidemic. But salt did something far more sinister. It built Europe's first fortified city just to lock you out. Which do you think has had a more profound impact on human behavior throughout history, sugar or salt? Let us know your take in the comments. Salt's transformation from survival mineral to political instrument happened quickly and without anyone appearing to notice. Inside early agricultural communities, control over the only salt spring within 50 miles was control over everyone who depended on it. A leader who managed salt distribution could reward loyalty, cement alliances, and punish rivals by withholding a mineral the human body cannot synthesize internally and cannot survive long without. Salt was the world's first renewable political currency, predating coinage by several thousand years and considerably harder to argue with than a promise. Before salt became currency, it became chemistry. Early humans discovered that when fresh meat or fish was buried in dry mineral salt, a powerful phenomenon called osmosis occurred. The concentrated salt crystals pulled liquid water out of animal cells and bacterial cells simultaneously, dehydrating the tissue below the moisture threshold where decay-causing bacteria can reproduce. The mechanism required no understanding of microbiology, no laboratory, and no refrigeration. It required only the observation that salted meat did not rot while unsalted meat did. This was a discovery so consequential that it is difficult to overstate. For the first time in human history, communities could preserve hundreds of kilograms of salted fish and meat through entire winters, across months-long sea voyages, and throughout military campaigns that moved armies thousands of miles from any fresh food source. Consider what this meant for the structure of civilization itself. Before salt preservation, every large settlement faced a fundamental size limit imposed by how quickly fresh food could be hunted, gathered, and consumed before it spoiled. Salt shattered that limit. Populations could now store seasonal surpluses, provision armies that never stopped moving, and support specialist workers who did not hunt or farm personally but depended on stored food that someone else had preserved. Salt became the foundational technology that allowed large-scale civilization, long-distance trade networks, and empire building to function. You cannot march an army on fresh meat alone. You can march it indefinitely on salt-cured provisions. This was not a logistical footnote to ancient history. It was the operating system on which classical antiquity ran, and the entire salt-driven economy that followed was built on top of it. Ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman physicians understood salt's power well beyond the kitchen. Medical papyri from ancient Egypt records salt solutions used to clean infected wounds, draw out inflammation, and preserve mummified remains. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Roman practitioners like Galen prescribed brine rinses for skin infections and digestive ailments. Salt was not merely a food flavor in the ancient world. It was a sacred, life-giving substance whose medical applications were taken seriously by every major civilization in the ancient world, and whose scarcity or abundance determined whether armies could function, populations could survive winter, and cities could exist at all. As civilizations expanded, the politics of salt went international. Ancient Rome built part of its empire on its ability to control salt supply and distribution. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, ran from the Adriatic coast into the heart of Rome and was one of the most strategically defended highways in the ancient world. The word salarium, related to sol, appears in Roman sources as a financial allowance, and from it, the English word salary eventually derived. It is a popular and appealing claim that Roman soldiers were paid directly in physical salt rather than coin. Here, a note of historical caution is warranted. As Cambridge classicist Mary Beard and other ancient historians have pointed out, no surviving primary Latin source actually confirms that soldiers received literal salt as wages rather than money to buy it. The linguistic connection between salary and salt is real. The paycheck as seasoning version is a tidier story than the evidence supports, which is precisely the kind of story that tends to survive for centuries intact. Even the word soldier may derive from the Latin sal dare, to give salt, though historians flag this too as compelling rather than confirmed. Across West Africa, merchants traded slabs of rock salt weight for weight against pure gold, and that transaction is extremely well documented and needs no myth to make it dramatic. In medieval Europe, the social politics of salt became domestic architecture. The carved wooden salt cellar occupied the center of the formal dinner table, and your seat relative to it announced your social rank to every person in the room with the efficiency of a printed label. Honored guests sat above the salt. Servants, low-ranking visitors, and individuals being quietly punished sat below it. This was not metaphor. It was a seating chart enforced by the placement of a condiment vessel. Salt had become a social sorting mechanism with no moving parts, requiring no explanation and visible to everyone simultaneously. The logic of Solnitsada's salt merchants applied to indoor dining management across 2,000 years of intervening history without a single modification. Medieval France pushed the logic further. The gabelle, France's notorious salt tax, was introduced in the 14th century and remained in force for over 400 years. Under its most punishing form, every French citizen above a certain age was legally required to purchase a fixed minimum quantity of salt per year from government salt warehouses at government fixed prices, regardless of whether they needed it. Possession of salt from any source other than the official warehouse was a criminal offense. Salt smuggling was punishable by imprisonment, forced labor on royal galleys, and occasionally death. The hated gabelle was one of the grievances listed by the French peasantry in the lead-up to the French Revolution of 1789. The mineral that Neolithic farmers discovered by following deer to a rock face had by the 18th century become a mechanism of state coercion so resented that it contributed to the overthrow of a monarchy. Salt, from Solnitsada to Versailles, had a consistent habit of being at the center of every society's most consequential arguments about power. When a government turns a basic survival mineral into a state monopoly punishable by death, rebellion isn't just likely, it becomes inevitable. If you find it wild that a salt tax helped trigger the overthrow of the French monarchy, share your perspective in the comments below. In 1930, on the other side of the world, a 60-year-old Indian independence leader named Mahatma Gandhi walked 240 miles to the Arabian Sea coastline with a following that grew from 78 companions to tens of thousands along the route. At the beach near the town of Dandi, he picked up a small lump of naturally evaporated salt from the mudflats. The act was deliberate, symbolic, and illegal. The British Empire's Salt Act had made it a criminal offense for Indian citizens to produce or collect salt without purchasing it from government-licensed suppliers and paying a colonial tax. Britain had taken the ancient logic of the Solnitsada salt merchant, controlling access to an essential mineral as a mechanism of political and economic power, and encoded it into law across an entire subcontinent. Gandhi's point was simple and irrefutable. This was a mineral that fell from the ocean onto beaches where anyone could pick it up, and the colonial government was taxing people for doing so, while those same people often could not afford enough salt to stay healthy. The Salt March triggered the largest wave of civil disobedience in the Indian independence movement, resulting in over 60,000 arrests, and sent a message that an empire enforcing a salt tax on the world's second most populous nation had miscalculated something fundamental about how long that arrangement would last. Salt did not defeat the British Empire alone, but it handed Gandhi a weapon so viscerally understood by every Indian citizen, rich, poor, rural, urban, that no further explanation was required. The mineral that built Europe's first fortified city helped accelerate the dismantling of one of the largest empires in human history. Salt has a way of being present at exactly the moment when power changes hands. If you value the freedom to access essential resources, share your thoughts on how Gandhi used a handful of salt to defy an empire in the comments. Behind the golden history of salt lies an uglier one that the polished version tends to skip. For thousands of years, retrieving pure rock salt from deep underground deposits required the labor of enslaved and coerced workers. In the ancient mines of Hallstatt in Austria and Wieliczka in Poland, workers spent their lives underground in suffocating shafts, breathing salt dust, hauling heavy loads by hand, sustaining injuries that shortened lives considerably. The mineral that kept armies marching and empires functioning was extracted by people who received none of the credit and almost none of the benefit. The salt you reach for effortlessly at a supermarket checkout represents the terminal end of a supply chain that, for most of human history, ran on human suffering at the extraction point. That is not a comfortable thought to hold alongside a snack. It is, however, an accurate one. Salt's democratization came with the Industrial Revolution. Modern vacuum evaporation and chemical refining made sodium chloride so cheap and abundant that industrial food manufacturers began adding it to almost everything: potato chips, cured meats, canned soups, bread, ready meals, savory sauces, and eventually to foods where you would not expect it, including sweet baked goods, cereals, and dairy products. The salt that once required enslaved labor, fortified cities, and international trade wars to obtain was suddenly cheap enough to be used as a packaging filler. The scarcity problem was solved with the thoroughness of someone who fundamentally misunderstood what the original problem was. Nobody consulted the kidneys. Your kidneys contain a hormonal cascade called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, first described systematically by physiologist Irvine Page at the Cleveland Clinic in the 1940s. Under low sodium conditions, this system aggressively retains every recoverable sodium ion, suppresses urine output, and raises blood pressure to maintain delivery of whatever sodium remains in circulation. In the prehistoric wilderness, calibrated for a world where salt was scarce and periods of low intake were long, this system was exactly what kept you alive through seasons of dietary sodium shortfall. In a world where sodium-heavy products occupy entire supermarket aisles, the drought the system was built to manage never arrives. The retention mechanism stays partially activated around the clock. Chronically elevated blood pressure follows. According to extensive clinical research synthesized by the World Health Organization, high blood pressure, driven substantially by chronic excess sodium consumption in industrialized diets, is the single largest risk factor for cardiovascular disease globally, affecting over 1 billion people. We engineered infinite salt availability for a body built to treat salt as precious and rare, and then expressed collective surprise when cardiovascular disease became the world's leading cause of death. The gap between the environment we built and the body we brought to it is not a mystery requiring further investigation. It is a predictable outcome of running a prehistoric survival system in a post-industrial food landscape, and acknowledging that gap is the beginning of actually addressing it. The next time you feel an irresistible pull towards something salty late at night, or statistically within 20 minutes of reading this sentence, try not to read it as evidence of personal weakness. You are running the exact same biological software as a Neolithic farmer who survived an electrolyte collapse by following deer tracks to a salt lick on a Bulgarian hillside 10,000 years ago. Your system is doing precisely what it evolved to do. The problem is not the software. The problem is that the update has not arrived, the supermarket has not closed, and evolution is famously slow to respond to feedback from the cardiovascular ward. Subscribe now to keep digging into the evolutionary history of the body you inhabit, so you can start working with your biology instead of against it.